Thanksgiving weekend, 1998. Atlantic Beach, Florida. 25-year-old Corey Parker, bright, independent, and full of life, was found brutally stabbed inside her apartment. The scene was so violent, so disturbing, that even seasoned detectives were left shaken. Who could have done this? And why target Corey? What followed was a cold case that haunted her family, her friends, and an entire community for years, until a shocking breakthrough revealed a killer hiding in plain sight. To understand the weight of this tragedy, we first need to know who Corey Parker was. Corey was just 25 years old, living in a small apartment near the beach in Atlantic Beach, Florida. She worked as a waitress at a popular local restaurant and was known for her warm smile and easy laughter. Friends describe her as free-spirited, kind-hearted, and full of energy. She loved the beach, the ocean breeze, and the simple joy of spending time with friends. Corey had big dreams. She wasn't just waiting tables. She was building her future, one step at a time. She had graduated from college and was figuring out where life would take her next. Those who knew Corey say she had a magnetic personality. She could walk into a room and instantly make friends. But behind that energy was also a young woman just beginning to carve out her own life, far away from home, in a community where she was still finding her place. Her apartment on Ocean Boulevard was more than just a home. It was her space of independence, her sanctuary. But on that Thanksgiving weekend in 1998, it would become the scene of an unimaginable crime. In Atlantic Beach, Florida, the life of 25-year-old Corey Lynn Parker would be discovered in the most brutal way imaginable. Corey had planned to stay in Florida over the holiday. Originally from Rochester, New York, she had moved south for school and to chase a life by the beach. She worked part-time as a waitress at Ragtime Tavern in Atlantic Beach, supporting school and paying her own way. When she failed to show up for her Friday shift, alarm bells rang. A coworker went to check on her. The apartment was silent. No response at the door. He circled to a bedroom window, peeped inside, and saw something chilling, the edge of a body motionless, surrounded by blood. He called for police. At the scene, it was obvious. This was not an accident. This was pure violence. Blood spattered across walls and bedding. The body was arranged in a sexually suggestive pose, though investigators found no evidence of sexual assault. The medical examiner's report would later confirm 101 stab wounds, some inflicted before death, many after. Defensive wounds were found on her hands and arms. A slash to her neck severed major arteries. Her final moments were violent, painful, and merciless. But the crime scene held even more puzzles. Corey's apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Doors and locks were intact. That indicated the killer either entered by another way or was already inside. Investigators found traces of blood in the kitchen near the sink, and on the inside and outside of the kitchen windowsill. It suggested the perpetrator entered or exited via that window, possibly slipping in under the radar or fleeing that way. The clothes she had worn the night before, going out with friends, were found folded neatly at the foot of her bed. Nothing seemed missing. No robbery. Nothing out of place. That detail deepened the sense that this crime wasn't about money. It was personal, dark, deeply intentional. Pieces of the puzzle floated. Strands of hair in her underwear, blood smears, the strange layout of the room, and the brutal nature of the attack. But no clear suspect. No motive. No path forward, yet. For Corey's family and her friends, the horror of that discovery became a permanent scar. A joyful young woman, full of life, was found in horrific circumstances. The questions were severe, and the answers were buried in shadows. This was the moment when the outstanding endurance of investigators would be tested. Because the scene was savage, dense with forensic clues, yet the killer remained invisible. Because there was no forced entry, detectives immediately considered that Corey might have known her attacker, or at least that the attacker had access. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed maintenance logs, canvassed the block of apartments. Attention turned to co-workers and acquaintances. 2 co-workers stood out: Eric Jones, a dishwasher who had aired feelings about Corey, even allegedly trying to host Thanksgiving dinner for her, and Tiffany Zienta, a friend who claimed she had stayed out with Corey on the night before Thanksgiving and later tried to be near the crime scene. But when DNA collected from the crime scene was processed, it did not match either of them. Investigators also examined phone record. Tiffany claimed she called Corey around 2 a.m. to check on her. Corey supposedly replied she was asleep. But phone logs revealed no such call was recorded. That inconsistency heightened suspicion but offered no conclusive link. Meanwhile, Robert Denny's behavior raised red flags. Robert Eric Denny lived just 35 yards away, across the complex. His sister's apartment had a direct view into Corey's back window. That proximity could not be ignored. After the murder, witnesses said he was emotional, crying, claiming his son had died in Texas, though no such son existed. He was later questioned by the police. Still, 4 years, none of these leads were enough. Each suspect was cleared or lacked concrete ties. The DNA profile remained unmatched for a long time. The case hovered in suspicion, rattling nerves, but refusing closure. The crime was horrifying. The clues were there. But the identity of the killer stayed hidden in those shadows, until bodies of evidence finally came together. At first, detectives struggled. Corey's apartment showed signs of a fierce struggle, but not enough to point to one clear suspect. There were no immediate fingerprints that matched anyone in the system, no obvious motive, and no witnesses who saw someone enter or leave that night. The case felt like smoke. Real, but impossible to hold. But as days turned into weeks, small clues began to emerge. Tiny fragments that, alone, meant little but together, hinted at something bigger. Detectives discovered that Corey's attacker had left behind microscopic traces of DNA. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect right away, but it was enough to preserve hope. At the time, forensic technology was still limited, but science was catching up, and investigators knew that someday, this clue might speak louder than words. During investigation, neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the early hours, muffled sounds that didn't make sense until after the murder was discovered. Some even recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure moving near Corey's building, though no one could describe him clearly. A shadow among shadows. Then came a chilling detail. The way Corey was attacked suggested the killer knew something about her routine. This didn't look random. Whoever did this may have been watching her, studying her, waiting for the perfect opportunity. As detectives pieced together the puzzle, every new lead seemed to create more questions than answers. Was this someone Corey knew? A stranger who had fixated on her? Or someone who crossed her path only once, but decided she would be the target? The DNA sat frozen in storage, silent but powerful, waiting for the day science could unlock its secret. For Corey's friends, her family, and an entire community, it was a tormenting thought. The answers were there, hidden in plain sight. But the killer was still free. The case grew colder by the month, then by the year. Corey's photograph remained on desks, in case files, and on the walls of investigators' minds. Always there. Always unanswered. And while Jacksonville Beach tried to move forward, the story of Corey Parker lingered like a shadow over the community, a reminder that her killer was still out there, walking freely. For nearly 2 decades, the case of Corey Parker haunted Atlantic Beach. Detectives had DNA, strong, undeniable evidence left behind at the crime scene. But there was a problem. Back in 1998, that DNA profile had no match in the national database. It was like having the killer's fingerprint, but no name to go with it. As the years passed, technology advanced. Cold case detectives revisited Corey's file again and again, refusing to let it fade away. They knew the killer's identity was hidden inside those genetic markers. They just had to find the person who matched. Then, suspicion began to circle around a name: Robert Eric Denny. Denny was a young man at the time of Corey's murder. He lived not far from her apartment. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, blending into everyday life. But investigators believed otherwise. They needed proof, scientific proof that he was the man behind the brutal stabbing of Corey Parker. Detectives knew they needed a DNA sample from Robert Denny, but they couldn't just ask him for it. And so, police turned to a quiet but effective strategy. They followed Denny in secret, waiting for the right moment, watching him closely. One evening, Denny stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and after a few puffs, tossed it to the ground. Denny tossed away something most of us never think twice about, an item carrying his DNA. That small, careless act gave detectives exactly what they needed. They collected the cigarette butt, sent it to the lab, and compared it against the profile that had been sitting in cold storage since 1998. Within days, the results came back. The DNA on that cigarette matched the DNA from Corey Parker's crime scene. It was the break investigators had been waiting for, the final piece that tied Denny to the brutal murder. The results came back clear as day. It was him. Robert Eric Denny's DNA matched the killer's. After nearly 20 years of questions, investigators finally had their answer. The walls were closing in, and the man who thought he had escaped justice was about to face it head-on. After the DNA match pointed to Robert Eric Denny, investigators moved quickly. In 2001, Denny was officially charged with the first-degree murder of Corey Parker. For the first time in nearly 3 years, Corey's family felt a glimmer of hope. The case that had once seemed unsolvable was finally moving toward justice. But the road to trial wasn't simple. Denny's defense team argued that DNA alone wasn't enough to convict him. They questioned how the evidence was collected and whether someone else could have been responsible. Prosecutors, however, were confident. The DNA didn't lie. It placed Denny inside Corey's apartment the night she was brutally killed. As the trial opened, the courtroom was filled with tension. The discarded cigarette but became the star of the case. Prosecutors explained to the jury how Denny's DNA was found on that tiny filter, and how it matched the DNA left behind at Corey Parker's apartment. Piece by piece, the science told the story Denny couldn't escape. The defense tried to argue, maybe the DNA was a mistake, maybe there was another explanation. But the jury listened closely as forensic experts testified. The evidence was overwhelming. That cigarette butt, tossed away without a second thought, sealed Robert Denny's fate. He was no longer just a suspect. He was the killer. Corey's family sat quietly in the gallery, facing the young man accused of taking her life. Denny, dressed in a suit, looked more like a college student than a killer. But the evidence painted a different picture. Prosecutors laid out the crime scene in chilling detail. They described how Corey was stabbed multiple times while fighting desperately for her life. They showed photographs, explained the forensic timeline, and walked jurors through how Denny's DNA matched samples found at the scene. The defense tried to cast doubt. They suggested there was no motive. They argued that Corey and Denny didn't have a close relationship. But the prosecution countered, Denny didn't need a relationship. He had an opportunity, an obsession, and the DNA that tied him to the murder. After days of testimony, the case went to the jury. The wait was excruciating for Corey's loved ones. Hours passed, then a full day. And finally, the verdict. Guilty. Denny was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Corey's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Nothing could bring Corey back, but the man who took her from them would never walk free again. As the gavel came down, the long shadow of November 26, 1998, finally lifted. Justice had been served. Corey Parker's story didn't end in the courtroom. For those who knew her, she wasn't just another name in a cold case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman full of dreams. She was only 25 years old when her life was stolen. Friends remembered her as energetic, witty, and passionate about the simple joys of life. She loved her job as a waitress at a local restaurant, and she dreamed of building a future filled with laughter, adventure, and love. Her absence left an empty space that could never be filled. For Corey's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring true peace. They had endured years of fear and uncertainty, wondering if her killer would ever be caught. Now they live with the bittersweet knowledge that justice was served, but at the cost of a life that was far too short. In the years since, Corey's case has stood as a powerful reminder of the role forensic science plays in solving cold cases. Advances in DNA testing turned what seemed impossible into undeniable proof. Without it, Robert Eric Denny might still be free today. The case also left a lasting impact on the community of Atlantic Beach. For a long time, Corey's murder cast a shadow of fear, reminding everyone how fragile life can be. But when her killer was brought to justice, it also became a story of resilience, a story that proved no matter how much time passes, the truth can still find its way to the light. Today, Corey's legacy lives on in the hearts of those who loved her. And her story continues to echo in the halls of justice, inspiring investigators to keep fighting for answers in cold cases across the country. Because in the end, Corey Parker was more than a victim. She was a vibrant young woman whose memory continues to remind us why justice matters.